All right. Good morning, everybody. So today, what we're going to be doing is moving on to a new part of Chapter 22, which is Section 3, and that is titled Choosing a Candidate. Okay. Um, as we know so far, political parties, that when it comes to political parties, that is their main job. They want to choose the best possible candidates to run for different levels of political office, both, with local and state and federal levels or national levels. Another word for federal. You will see that vocab is highlighted, and I've also I've only highlighted the terms that I want you to know. There are also some videos included on some of these slides. Some of these videos are going to be made into ed puzzles or already have been made into ed puzzles. Some of them you can just watch at your leisure if you choose to, and we will. It just kind of reinforces some of the major points and topics that we're covering right now. So before we begin, let's start with this little paragraph here. So I'll just read it along with you guys. The most important role of political parties is nominating candidates who will run for office. Parties play an important part in deciding who our political officials will be based on their nominations. Taking a look at the nominating process for candidates in general and for presidential candidates in particular, which is what our focus is today, is a good way to see parties in action. Okay. Let's see. Just messing around with the mouse. All right. Sorry about that. So I just want to fix something quick. So again, we're going to be focusing on the main role that political parties play, which is selecting candidates, selecting the appropriate candidates. We're going to focus specifically on presidential candidates, although political parties play a role in electing governors, senators, even town councilmen and women, city councilors, all different levels of government. So nominating candidates, okay? So the first step in doing so is to obviously declare that you want to run. You can't just do it in secret because then obviously no one's going to know and no one's going to vote for you. So the easiest way to do so is going through the self-nomination process, which means you are officially declaring that you are running for political office. Presidential candidates do this. Candidates for the Senate, House of Representatives, in Congress, they do this. Mayors, governors. I mean, they all do this. They all go through the same process of self-nomination. They have to usually pay a small filing fee to officially, announce that they are running for a particular place in our government. And another type of self-nomination, which can be kind of funny, and it's actually brought a little bit of comedy into politics, is the write-in candidate. So it's a write-in would be one who asks voters to write his or her name on a ballot. And there have been some very interesting write-ins in the past, which we will go over in a little bit. For some offices, okay, a candidate may need to file a nominating petition, okay, which is a number of voters that must sign the petition saying that they support the nomination. So if you don't get enough votes to run, so if you send out a nominating petition and you don't get the right amount of people or a certain number of people to support your nomination, then it doesn't really go through. In some cases, that's different, but generally speaking, a nominating petition, you need a number of voters to sign the petition saying that they will support your nomination. For other offices, candidates are chosen by delegates at party meetings called conventions. We've talked about national conventions and state conventions, and these conventions are held by both the Republican and Democratic parties primarily at the local, state, and national levels. So as I mentioned before, there have been some very interesting write-ins. Certain people, and literally what it is, guys, when you guys are able to vote, you'll notice that there's a write-in section. okay, where you can literally write in anyone's name that you want. But if you write that person's name in, you have to vote for that person. And so it's you saying that you're voting for that person. Some interesting people and figures that have been nominated for presidential office and other offices as well have been Mickey Mouse. Jesus has also been nominated. We have Kanye West, Harambe. I know a lot of you remember Harambe. Rest in peace. So you can kind of get my point here. A lot of people don't really take the write-in process very seriously. Okay, it was intended to, put in someone's name who, certain people felt should be in the process of, being elected. But a lot of people just do it in like a joking way, and it is, it does make for some good comedy and some good laughs for sure. So there are different ways that people go about voting. Okay. There are most states do it one particular way. We call those direct primaries. And we'll get into that in a minute. But before we get there are a few states that are involved in what's called a caucus. Okay. So few states select candidates or choose delegates to conventions at a caucus, which is a meeting of party leaders to discuss issues or to choose candidates. The two main caucuses that people tend to really, focus on, especially the Iowa caucus and the Nevada caucuses. All right. So it's pretty much like a town hall meeting sort of thing. And it's very old school. And that's kind of the reason why you don't see many states going along with these caucuses in a way. So the video here that's included shows you how a caucus really works. But again, it's like very town hallish. Like you get to meet the candidate, the party leaders who are sent to these polling places, and they literally just talk to you like in these big, auditorium settings. Sometimes most of the time smaller settings than that, and then you just kind of talk to all the leaders, and then based on that you vote. Okay, so it's a little different than how regular primaries work. The more common way of voting, as I mentioned, was most candidates for state and federal office are now chosen in a direct primary. Okay, and there are two types of direct primaries that we're going to get into. This is an election in which members of a political party choose candidates to run for office in the name of the party. Okay, and in general, the candidates with the most votes in that party's nominee is that party's nominee in the general election. So this is kind of like when I was showing you guys a map of the primaries as they were going on before COVID and all, where it showed, based on the number of votes, which candidate was going to win. Like we focused mainly on the Democratic primaries just because Trump pretty much had it in the bag at that point. So we were showing states that were voting for Biden, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and each state was a different color based on, who won that state. And what we meant by that was who got the most votes. Okay. And we talked about how depending on the number of votes you get a certain number of delegates. Okay. And then those delegates have to cast a vote in your favor. We'll get more into that later, but that's generally what it is. Pretty much, you want the most votes, as many votes as possible. The more votes you get, the more support you're going to get from that state. All right, so this is a map. I remember showing you guys this. We talked about the number of delegates. Okay, is 1991, 1,991. We talked about that, the year I was born. So if you take a look at the map, again, we looked at similar maps and graphs that were, not exactly like this, but in general, did a pretty good job of showing the number of delegates, okay? The number of delegates in each state, okay? That, that eventually will translate into electoral votes and whatnot when the, presidential election kicks off later on in the year. But again, the more delegates you get, again, you want to get to this number, 1991. Once you get to 1991, you have won that. You've won that nominee, and the depending on the party, okay, you have the Republican and Democratic parties. If you have that number of delegates, then you win the nomination for president, and then you have the right to run for president obviously, for that party. So this is just a map that kind of shows that. Obviously, the bigger states have more delegates than the smaller states, as you can see. Like Rhode Island right there is 26. And then you have Texas, 228, and California, 415. Obviously, way more. And again, it depends on the size of the state. So we talked about those two primaries. There's a closed primary and an open primary. Okay, so there is a distinct difference between the two. So in order to vote in a closed primary, and before I get any further, some states are open primary states, some are closed primary states. So if Nevada, not Nevada, that's a bad example. Washington, okay, Washington State, if they were a closed primary state, then the entire state operates with closed primaries. If they were an open primary state, then the entire state operates with open primaries. Okay, so back to the two different types. A closed primary is when a voter must be registered as a party member. Okay, so they have to be part of a political party. Okay, they may only vote in that party's primary. So if there were two candidates for the Democratic, just like we were talking about earlier this year, Biden and Sanders were going at it before Biden, eventually pretty much won the nomination already, even though it's not technically official. It will be soon. If I were a Republican, I would not be allowed to vote in that primary. Okay, if I'm a registered Republican, I could not vote in a closed primary for Biden and Sanders because they are running under the Democratic Party. Okay. For open primaries, voters do not need to declare a party before voting. So Rhode Island is an open primary state. So I don't need to be a Republican or a Democrat in order to vote. I can just show up, and as long as I'm a registered voter, I can vote. And again, it's only one vote per person. So they may vote in only one party primary, though. You have to pick. Okay, you got to make sure you pick the one that you're going to vote for. So those are the two distinct differences. Here's a map of the different states that have closed, open, and also there's something called modified primaries. They're a little different. We won't really get into that today, but as you can see, it's kind of spread out. Again, I would say there's probably more open primaries than there are closed primaries. It is pretty close, but for the most part, open primaries tend to be the more popular primary. All right, so when it comes to selecting a presidential candidate, there are some boxes that a person needs to check off in order to be eligible to run for president. Okay, so anyone over the age of 35 and is born in the United States may run for president. Ideally, the candidate needs to be a well-known candidate in a way, someone with a lot of popularity that has experience in government. Now, as we know, Trump kind of changed that. All right, so he proved that you don't necessarily need to have a government background in order to not only run for president but win the election, which he did against Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, although Trump did that, it is more likely that a person with a political background is generally going to have a better chance of winning in a presidential election. Okay, and they also need to be able to raise enough money because we'll look at a chart in a minute that shows how much money these candidates truly need to run these campaigns. It's pretty wild. Most presidential candidates from the major parties have held elected office before, as I said, seeking the nomination for presidency. 80% of presidential, candidates and winners in general have been senators or governors, meaning that if you want to run for president, you probably should have an extensive background in politics before you run for president. It strengthens your case. Paying for a primary campaign. So there are several ways that you can do this, but there are a couple we're going to focus on primarily. And there's some videos that are included here based on what we talk about. So candidates raise much of their money from individuals, people like us. People like us will donate their money to their campaigns as a way to help help the candidates move on and do well in the campaign. That money will pay for advertising, that pays for travel, holding political rallies, okay, all different things. That money is used in so many different ways. Federal laws, however, say that individuals may contribute only $2,000 to each candidate per election. So you can't be some billionaire who really wants one candidate to win and throw like $500,000 at their campaign. Federal law says you can only donate like $2,000. All right, which again is it's not chump change. It may be in the eyes of a presidential candidate, but for me to just throw $2,000 at a candidate, that's quite a bit of money to just use in one action. But it does happen quite a bit. So to give you guys an example of what we're talking about here when it comes to the money that's spent in campaigns, starting, and I'm trying to move my face so it doesn't get in the way, starting in 1960 and going to 2016. Okay, so the blue bars represent the Democratic presidential candidates, and the red bar represents the Republican presidential candidates. So as you can see, as time has gone on, people are spending a lot more money. Okay, so for example, we don't see until like 1992 when Bill Clinton, who wins that election in 1992, he spent over $100 million on his campaign. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money in any way that you shape it. That's a lot of money. But compare that to the more recent elections like 2008, 2012, even 2016. Obama, for example, who won in 2008 against, at the time, Senator John McCain, who has since passed away, actually. Obama raised almost $700 million, or so I wouldn't say raised, but spent over almost $700 million, over $700 million on his campaign. The same goes for Obama in 2012 when he won his second consecutive election. He spent around $800 million on his campaign. Now, we'll get into super PACs in a minute and PACs in general and what that means. But just to show you guys, this is not something that you kind of, and I'm, for lack of a better term, you can't half-ass a presidential election. You're either going to be all in or you're not all in. And if you're all in, you're going to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, okay? And generally, you need to spend that money in order to win. However, you will see here, in 2016, Trump did spend a lot less money than Hillary Clinton, and he won. So it doesn't always mean like whoever spends the most is going to win. That's not really how it works, but it doesn't hurt either. So PACs, what are PACs? This video is great, by the way, above my face right here. I would definitely give that a look. Political Action Committee, that's what PAC stands for, okay? It's a way for people to pool their money together to make political action. So now that PACs have become a thing, and they've been a thing for a little while, so this isn't anything new. The PACs are not, there are some rules with PACs. So they're not allowed to take money or contributions from corporations, but an individual can give up to $5,000 each to a political action committee. Okay. And they can't be in any way aligned with the campaign. They have to be not affiliated with like the actual campaign process, but they are allowed to give that money. So things have changed a little bit. Nowadays, though, since 2010, this new thing called super PACs, okay, super PACs became a thing, which without me reading this definition, you guys can read that on your own. It pretty much gives these candidates the ability to use unlimited resources, unlimited money. So people can, throw as much money as they want to now at these super PACs, political action committees, in order to help their presidential candidate or the person they want to win, to give them a real good fighting chance to win. So money is becoming more and more of a factor when it comes to elections these days. And when it comes to choosing delegates, okay, we talked about that word delegate. There's a video here that talks about super delegates, which we'll talk about a little later. Delegates to the national conventions are chosen in one of two ways. So, in order to be a delegate or to become a delegate, they may be chosen through a presidential preference primary election, kind of like we talked about before, or they may be chosen through a statewide caucus or convention process. So, by one of those two ways, you can become a delegate. In most primary states, delegates must promise to support a certain candidate at the national convention. So, for example, if you're a delegate in Rhode Island and there's a lot of votes for Biden and not as many for Bernie, let's say Biden just cleans house, does really, really well in Rhode Island. If I'm a delegate for Rhode Island, I have to abide by the popular vote of Joe Biden. I can't just say, I'm just going to vote for Bernie because I don't like Biden. I only like Bernie. I can't do that. I have to go by what my state does. I have to reflect the voters in that state. That's the pledge that I take. Okay. And at the end of this whole process, so after the primaries have been completed, there are national conventions that are held for both parties. Different conventions, okay? They're held in different locations at different times. In a presidential election year, the parties hold their national conventions. The delegates who go to these conventions debate and discuss the candidates, but also create and vote on the party platform. We talked about platforms a little while ago, what the party's stance is on many different topics. Because of the primaries, almost all delegates are pledged to the candidate before the convention even happens, because the primaries are done. So we already know where the delegates are going as far as the candidates go. And once the president and VP are chosen by each party, so the presidential candidate and the president's choice of vice president, it's on to the general election. And that is when the Republican and Democratic nominees go head to head. And in November, the presidential election takes place. Okay, so that is it for today as far as 22-3 is concerned. Please take a look at anything else that I have written down on Classroom today. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Bye.